Thanks, Brian. And look, I just want to first thank David and the Mount Barker City Council for having us here, for putting on a great event, for the hospitality you've sent to all of us. So thank you very much for that. It is much appreciated. First off, I just want to say I'm going to put my wife onto Sophie, because there's an argument in my house every day about synthetic lawns. I love my lawn. She wants synthetic lawn. It's not going to happen, but I'll put her onto your website just to finish off that argument. So thank you very much for that. So our next speaker, Jen Michelmore. Jen is the CEO of the Studio THI, an independent non-for-profit urban change specialist. Studio THI is committed to building trust between communities, government and urban change sector to help develop equitable and resilient urban futures. For growth area councils, change is constant. Each year, in fact, each day, our communities are changing and growing. And as councils, it is our part to take our communities on this journey. Penrith City Council is pleased to be participating, along with Hume City Council, of Jen's current intake of Step Change City Partnerships. Jen is leading a dialogue with local, state governments and developers to find ways to best support communities and organisations through urban change. Please welcome Jen to provide an update on the Partnerships project. Jen.
Thank you, Councillor Todd, for that introduction. And unfortunately, I have the difficult task of going after a Logie winner, which I am not. I am also a resilient gardener, as in I try, I fail, I keep trying, and I keep trying. I am trying to grow things. We do have some chooks, which is great in our backyard in Brisbane, in urban Brisbane. But I am also not a planner, so I'm putting all the things that I'm not out into the audience today, because it gives some context to the room. But what I am is I'm very passionate and an enthusiastic thinker, tinkerer and trier of looking at how we as a sector, that being local government, state government, developers, consultancies, peak bodies, can actually use this once in a generation opportunity to actually deliver great urban outcomes for our future. It is a privilege and it is a responsibility. And I think all of us, and particularly growth areas, you really do feel this in your day-to-day work. You understand the extent of what you are creating. You are creating new cities of the future and new places and homes, ideally for the next 100, 150 or more years. But at the same time, it's a huge privilege and a responsibility to actually manage all these challenges and things that are part of. Sorry, is this the clicker? This thing? No idea. Let's hope we... great. So I won't go into too much about our organisation, but what I will sort of open with today is that, so our work is looking at how we can think about urban change, look at it as a privilege and a responsibility, and think about how we as this system, so very crude sketches, but when we talk about urban change and transformational urban change, the kind of change, this privilege and responsibility change we need in our cities over time, we need all these stakeholders on that diagram there to all be thinking about how we can collectively champion and deliver step change urban agendas. So that's not our business as usual, that's what do we need to be doing differently today, tomorrow and the next day to actually make sure we're setting up great built environment that is great for humans, great for all the birds, bees and butterflies, great for our plant species, and great for everything else. And how do we actually help this system navigate the changing urban identity of those places? So a lot of these, in your context, you have paddock to postcard changes. You're also having established neighbourhoods that are going through significant change, that are having to change how they look and feel and experience as well. And we're also having to make those decisions not on the reactions or the pain that it's taking right now, because I know you as councillors and also local government experience a lot of the pain and a lot of people's individual reactions to change. But what we also have to be thinking about is what we're creating for that next 150-year future. So what I've just put at the top there is Suburbia 3.0. I think we're still in discussion of what that actually means. But what I'd like you to do just for 1 minute, or less than a minute, in your own mind, think about your local government area, so your city that you're here representing. What does Suburbia 3.0 look like to you? What do you see, hear, taste, feel, experience when you live in your Suburbia 3.0 of the future in your city? So just think about that. Now that's your individual view. Do you think that that view is aligned with your other councillor leadership team if you're a councillor? Is that aligned across your organisation? Would everyone within your own local government organisation have that view? Would the community understand and believe in that view as well? Would your state government agencies also have an aligned view? Would the federal government, and also would some of the peak bodies understand how to get you there? So if you think about your vision, where you think it needs to go, the types of changes you need to make, and all those stakeholders. And if you're very aligned, give yourself a 5. If you think you have no alignment, it's a 1. So if anyone, the lovely lady here in the very beautiful dress just smiled, so I'm going to actually ask her what your number was, if you don't mind sharing, 1 to 5. Hopeful 4, yep. Yep, that's great. That the actual reality is that's how. Anyone else brave enough to share theirs? You're a 3. I think you may have got the results, actually, though. You may have got, so Hume Mayor, so he would have seen some of the results for Hume as well. But what we started to think about then is to achieve these step change agendas in our city, urban change is political, it's also market-driven, people buy the things that have to be produced. And so when we're thinking about a systems change and what we're trying to achieve, we need all those stakeholders to believe in the change we're all trying to achieve together. So when we think about it like that, we started to do a lot of thinking around organisations, and you had all been through many change management experiences, but what we don't tend to do is put a change management or transformational lens on urban change. So often when we're talking about growth, we talk about how can we manage the numbers and build the houses we need to, which is great, we have to do that as well. But what we started to ask is, what if we actually said, what we're trying to do is lead transformational urban change in our city, which means we might have to have really challenging conversations. There might be difficult decisions that the community don't like that we have to actually push through. So what does that actually mean we might be doing differently if we sit in the shoes of our job is to lead the transformational change of our city for the betterment of future generations? And what does that mean we might start doing differently? So we started to develop a bit of a change management approach to urban change, or trying to actually start having this conversation. And our first part was, do you have an aligned North Star, which you just quickly did in your head, so I won't go too much into that, but do you have an aligned kind of flag in the air of where roughly we're trying to head and what we're trying to achieve? That doesn't need to be a perfect picture postcard of it, but just roughly, what are the things you're really trying to hold true to so you don't actually get lost along the way, or you're kind of not having any kind of flag on the hill where you're trying to go. Once we kind of have that flag on the hill, the next kind of step is almost to go backwards to go forwards, and to stand in the kind of space of understanding if our system is prepared for this North Star vision. So do they understand what we're trying to achieve? Do they know why it's important? Can they actually understand the challenges and benefits, and have we actually got people on board in that journey? And what we started to do was think about, well, if you were prepared, what do you need to have? And so there's a whole lot of things about preparedness, but I'll go into that in terms of our work that we've been doing, so you can understand how we're measuring preparedness of communities. So what we developed, because we were saying, well, does anyone collect some evidence around how change-ready our high growth and rapidly changing communities are? And the standing answer was no. So what we developed was something called the Urban Change Readiness Index, which is a research-based approach to actually talking to a representative sample of a community, because as you all know, actually, when you think about urban change, do you mainly hear from people who are anti-change, angry about certain things, or do you feel like you're hearing from a cross-section of a community? Angry, yeah, or angry, or not necessarily a cross-section of the community. So our first part was, how do we actually hear from a cross-section of the community to understand what their views are and understanding is of urban change in their community? So our framework, there's 3 key factors, which is understanding the community's urban change literacy, the place attachment and reattachment that we're going to have to do based on the change that's coming, and also their trust in the system actors' capacity and capability. Now I'm going to go through each of those chunks, sort of the theory of what we're trying to understand, and then show you the results that we've actually done in Hume, Penrith, Ballarat and Cairns. So the first one is urban change literacy. Now this is where Any planners in the room, you've probably been in many conversations like this, where everyone says, if you could get the community to understand planning and what great urban design outcomes are, then everything will be solved. It'll all be great. They'll thumbs up, they know exactly what we're trying to achieve. Then what we started to do when we work with communities was really unpack this and build their literacy about urban change. So firstly, an awareness of the built environment and how it impacts your everyday life. So it does people don't necessarily understand how the decisions they make on their house or their garden and things actually impact their daily life and their location. How the built environment has changed over time and continues to change. Why urban growth happens. So if you were to ask someone, why are we even growing? Why can't we stop growth? There's discussions around actually being able to answer that, which help people understand what's happening, and the proposed extent to change. And I'll go through some data in a minute, which just says how limited understanding people have in growth areas that they're even changing. Once we have some awareness, we then look at understanding. So what are those core concepts that us as practitioners use all the time? We were talking about urban infill, consolidation, all these other medium density housing, all these terms that we use that we're trying to achieve, and do we actually educate the community on what they are meaning and why they are important? What the challenges and benefits are of change and some of those cultural changes that might have to happen to get us out of cars and onto bikes and walking and cycling as well. And once we've got all that, that's when we feel we can start talking to communities about the types of changes coming in their location and them being part of those change discussions with us. The next part our index tries to understand is this kind of gap that we're saying between how attached people are to their place today and what they think the emerging future is starting to look like. So you can imagine when you go to a community and you start talking about next generation greenfield development, which is more dense than what perhaps they understand. It's including more medium density housing and some other components in it that perhaps they haven't seen before in a growth area. What do they start thinking about if they see some of those scenarios? Is that a step too far? Is it really challenging to get their heads around? And how do we actually understand how big the gap is between how attached they are today and what this future is starting to shape out like? And the final kind of part of our index that we're looking at is communities' understanding and trust in all those system actors. So we actually ask them who they trust in the urban change sector, which is between local government, state government, elected representatives, developers, and themselves as a community as well. And so what's their level of trust between the sector? And then the final part is we also look at community and ask them to think about things, understand where they are in their citizenship lens. So when we work with communities, and you would hear a lot of discussion around how things are very important for me, what do I need from this change and why am I feeling upset or things are changing in my area for something I don't like? The second position is what do I need from this, but what do others in my community need from change that aren't like me? So how do I actually proactively help community members to understand what other people's need in cities that they might not already have and they might not understand? And the third position is really that of future generations. So you can make decisions on what you need today, but we also need to be discussing with communities what we need in our cities for the next 30 to 100 years. And how do we actually really proactively make sure we're having those three levels of conversations with the communities, but also ourselves when we do decision making. So I won't go into that too much interest. Oh, actually, I might just go back to that one. To understand all those core concepts, we developed a 30-minute online survey. So it's a qualitative and quantitative survey that the communities do. The blue section you can see there, we change that content based on the specific discussion in your LGA. So when I'll go through a minute the Step Change Cities Partnership project we've done, we altered that part of the survey to match the drivers of Hume, the drivers of Penrith, the drivers in Cairns and the drivers in Ballarat. So we really were talking to the community about change in their context and the specific things happening in your location. So we can implement it, self-paced online 30-minute survey. And we distribute it to at least 150 people. Now, there's a lot of discussion around, is that enough? Should it be more? There needs to be 10,000, 3,000, whatever your number is. From our research, we've found 150 to 300 is about the sweet spot in terms of cost effectiveness to recruit and incentivize, because that's a cost. And so we're very conscious of not doing something that's cost prohibitive. But also with the qualitative and quantitative discussion within it, that does give us a rich set of data to actually start making meaningful discussion around. And also, I suppose, the other kind of little note is Our current way of understanding this is the 6 or 7 people who come to our electoral office or write objections to proposals. So we're kind of saying anything more than that is actually a great start. And when we actually look at the 150 people we want to talk to, we really specifically target the missing voices that we're often not hearing from. So that's young people, social and affordable housing tenants, renters, because often through some processes they're not actually heard because they're not landowners or ratepayers. So renters are someone we often include. Looking for community that are supportive of change if we can find them. And the one that we haven't included, but I think from the results that we've just been getting in, we're going to have to start really thinking about how we include future residents in these discussions, because particularly in growth areas, we need to make decisions with future residents in mind as well, and how do we actually start hearing from that voice? And that's a specific change we've done in our process since we've implemented the index. So to the partnerships, so we developed the index, THI did, and we used our estate to develop it because we didn't know if it was going to work. We developed the process. We implemented it as a pilot in Southeast Queensland, Greater Sydney and Greater Melbourne with 360 people, in 120 in each city. We found it was giving insightful data back, and so what we then next step went on to is actually forming something called the Step Change Cities Partnership, and phase 1 of that was to implement the Change Readiness Index in 4 local government areas, and the number of 4 local government areas here, and we have a number of you here in terms of your leadership positions here. We have Hume City Council, Penrith City Council, but also National Growth Areas Alliance supporting this discussion as well, because understanding this could be a really interesting discussion field for you as an alliance as well. So through Bronwyn's leadership and the other leaders of each of the local governments, we also brought in Greater Cities Commission, Victorian Planning Authority, Queensland Development, EDQ, and EDQ and the planning team in Queensland, ACT Government, EDQ, Economic Development area there as well. And also you would have seen we had a number of peak bodies, Local Government Association of Queensland and Australian Local Government Association, and also the peak bodies as well. So we've got, and Lend-Lease, sorry, I forgot the one private sector person we did get. So a wide selection of stakeholders, and the idea being they helped fund us doing this research so we could actually implement it in these 4 cities, and then we all came together once we got the initial data back to actually explore what does this start meaning we as a sector need to be doing differently. So, bit of context, the 4 councils that we did it in, it's quite interesting. We've got 2 growth areas which are in the room, and I probably don't need to go into that too much, but you can see their varying growth numbers. But we've also put 2 regional councils in there, really interestingly experiencing quite significant growth for their scale and size of cities, and what that starts meaning for communities that haven't actually experienced much growth before. So any growth is going to be quite a change for them. So we implemented our index in each of those cities, and we've heard from 780 residents. We've also heard from over 150 practitioners within our partnership exchange as well. I haven't got time to go through that data today, but we've also been looking at how the capabilities within our practitioners as well. So we get our questionnaire, we pull it all into an index outcome, which looks very pretty and lots of colours on a diagram, but what does that actually mean? So I've got a bit of time to take you through some of the results we've started to see and what that means for you. So our first major finding is that there is low, almost no awareness that they are living in areas that are growing and changing. So when I mean none, all these areas, as you saw, are growing by 50,000 to 150,000 people. And you can see on that diagram the lack of awareness. So red had no awareness that their city was growing by that much. So I think as practitioners, just a starting point, we might actually just assume people know we're growing because they see it. But what is not necessarily in people's consciousness is the extent in which you are going to grow and you are projected to grow. So just even that base awareness of that number is a really important outcome. And then even if you add to some extent in, people's awareness of the amount of growth coming is very limited. So of course, if you start seeing major changes and lots of construction, you're just not sure what's happening and why and where's all the infrastructure coming, and you just don't have a general understanding of that growth and what's coming. We then asked people how they feel about this change. Interestingly, I think a lot of people would think that most people would be angry. We actually found a lot of people were anxious. Anxious was okay, considering most of them had not heard about it, and it's literally the next question in the survey is like, are you aware of this growth? How are you feeling about it? Anxious. That's actually all right. That's actually a pretty good outcome. But There's also a level of excited and confident too, an excitement about what's to come, what that can bring for their community and how they can actually be on that journey with you. Yes, we do have some angry and fearful, and quite interestingly, I don't have the data up here for it, but when we've done this with some local government organisations and their staff, some of their staff are actually sitting higher proportion of angry and fearful about the change coming. And I think that the reason to note that, though, is that as planners or as people who are really excited or love change, like I love change, I love shaping futures, that's the thing I really get into. If you're not that kind of person and you're really not happy with where your city's going and you're a staff member of a local government that has to get on board in this, being conscious of that's a really important outcome. So this particular government we're working with are really changing how they're approaching a lot of their internal discussions around the challenge they have coming forward. So even though people didn't really know about it, they feel a bit anxious, they actually are generally supportive of growth and change as well. So I think there's also another assumption that people aren't supportive, but there is support, but just knowing what that's going to be like for them and how that change is going to play out for their city. The next thing that we learned is that there really isn't a mandate for change. So people don't understand why we can't just keep doing what we're already doing. So if you're currently in a growth area that's talking about we need more different types of density or diversity of housing, there's really a lack of understanding of why we can't just keep doing the same. And how we looked at that, we started to talk to people about then, we call it knowledge of business as usual. I didn't say that to the community members, but that's how we're framing it. So does the community have a knowledge of, is it okay to keep growing, continuing to take over farmland, growing out and out and out with single detached housing on the edge of cities, continuing exponentially? How do people feel about that? And you can see when we asked people that, a lot of people were very comfortable with that, which is really demonstrating a very low level of knowledge for this need to change and need for our cities to have a different shape, or we're not an infinite growth that just can keep happening. Some specifics of that, for instance, you can see Hume there. One of the examples, people said, isn't this the normal? I feel safe with that growth. And it actually links into some of the Hume's growth story coming up, which is where some of the established neighbourhoods are going to have to grow and change for the first time in their growth journey. So this is starting to really point to some big picture, tricky challenges that are going to happen soon. In Penrith, there's a lot of assumptions around families can't live in apartments. That doesn't work for families because everyone comes here for a large house. And that can be true, but also if you're looking at 50,000 new residents, people have migrants coming from overseas, there's very different needs, drivers and appetites, and understanding who those future residents might be and not just assuming they're a projection of today is quite an important change or different approach for people to understand. In Ballarat, it's a lot of heritage assets. There's no room to grow, we have to keep growing out. So there's some of the ways that people were demonstrating low levels of knowledge about that mandate or that need for a different type of urban outcome. I probably won't go too much into the highly knowledgeable. So another example from Hume, where a lady very beautifully wrote about her mother trying to find a suitable downsizing apartment for her in close proximity to where she lived, and they were unable to find anything because everything was 3-bedroom or 2-story and actually didn't use the word housing diversity and choice, but that was what she was talking about, that wasn't in their city and it was causing a lot of problems for her mum. They were in Ballarat, people were starting to be able to talk about we have this sprawl, we need to be more considerate where we put apartments in our city. So you can start seeing there is some knowledge in communities, but it's not of the proportion we really need to drive these big picture step change agendas in our cities. So the next kind of bit we look at is what's their awareness of some of those big picture concepts we're talking about. So generally, and we did this survey before, well, it was during for those planners in the room, the controversy around the 15-minute neighbourhood and you're restricting my movements. And a few people say, and a lot of planners feel like it's community are really going to hate, we can't use that 15-minute city strategy anymore, we can't talk about it. When we did it, that was all going on. Community had no idea about the strategies at all. So you can see here in Hume, they have a housing strategy plus a 20-minute city strategy. Penrith is a 30-minute, so slightly different, but generally some of those same new urbanism principles, walkable, compact, everything you need, access for daily life. We talked to the community about those strategies, pointed them to those strategies in each of the cities, and then asked them if they had any knowledge of those. So you can see, again, really limited knowledge of some of those key strategies that are the foundation things in which you're shaping growth and your conversations with communities around. But what they did say is that they actually are quite important. So they feel that they're actually important and attractive concepts to get right. So once they understood them, they're actually saying, okay, yes, I get that they're important for us to be thinking about and doing in our city. Now I'm just going to call this Suburbia 3.0 because there's very different types of scenarios we put here, but what we did in terms of looking at that future change with communities is we hand drew, and I'll show you, yep. So we hand drew little change scenarios that were relevant to each city. So you can see Ballarat's got slightly more heritage-y type assets in it and they'd pop up on top of heritage assets because that's how the density is going to have to happen for them. Hume and Penrith have a few more transit-oriented type growth happening around transit centres, and Cairns was around shopping centres. So what we did is we slightly altered the scenarios. What's remarkable is that many of your scenarios are actually very similar and fit under these three categories, which is because we were testing a bit of that ourselves. I think there might be some differences if you're in different types of LGAs more inner, but for growth areas and also some of these regional cities, they actually fit quite nicely. So scenario one's next generation greenfield, so those increased densities, smaller blocks. Scenario two is more townhouses in established areas, so actually starting to get some of that area might in, and then higher density around major nodes, whether that be a transport or shopping centre. So for each city, we described slightly different scenarios to them and then asked the community how they felt about those scenarios in their home, or in their neighbourhood, but also in their city generally, because then we could actually understand, I'm okay with those scenarios, but as long as it's not in my neighbourhood. And then what we started to do is plot some of those outcomes on our graph that we were talking about before. So I've just highlighted some of the discussion we've been having with the Hume and Penrith team. So in Hume, all the participants were actually highly attached, and for a growth area, that was quite a high outcome. Very moderately to very attached we thought was actually quite a high outcome compared, sort of Penrith was more moderately attached, which is more in line with what we've seen in other locations. What was interesting though, when we started to look, separate out the areas that are likely to change a lot and the scenarios that are most likely in their local area, people were starting to find that future quite challenging. So people were saying that future is, not even just sensible but challenging, but it's very challenging for us to think about that, particularly where some of the more established neighbourhoods in Hume were changing. That's a very challenging one for the Hume community. Whereas in some of the Penrith examples, I think a lot of the Penrith stuff was where we're starting to get more density around train stations. They've started to see some of that already come in. So the future scenarios are starting to almost push between challenging and unthinkable in some of those high impacted areas. Now you notice we don't ask people there if they're supportive or not of those scenarios. What we're asking them is how do they feel about them, and are they desirable through to unthinkable, because then that gives us understanding of where they're at and how we need to come into the conversation. I won't go into too much, but what we're able to do then is look at the scenario by LGA. So am I comfortable with that scenario in my local area? How do I feel about that in my city? How do I feel about it in my local area? So what we can start seeing is and we can then start mapping where some of those tension points might be between the strategies you've got and where communities are feeling like they need a bit more information. So the next thing we talk to people about is what they think the challenges, benefits, and things they'd like to know more about urban change in their community. And we were really testing from our own point of view, whether doing the Change Readiness Index had to happen by LGA. So we were testing, could we just do a general one where we recruit 10,000 people across Australia's growth and then just get the numbers? And what we were really testing is there going to be different answers, and is there a nuanced approach, and is there a need to actually do this index in a local area? And from our outcomes, we decided there really is, mainly because of some of these things. So what you can start seeing here is when we ask communities what their priorities are, and sorry, I keep looking to that because this screen's I can't read it. There's something very strange in it. So the urban change literacy, their priority challenges. So traffic congestion, yes, that's up there, but you can see places like Hume's actually talking about one of our challenges would be not delivering housing choice, because this is something that we're seeing is important to us, which didn't come up as a key thing in other cities. Things like lack of, it will impact the look and feel of today. So in Ballarat, that heritage asset and look and feel of how the regional city looks today is important. But what we started to see is there is various different priorities for communities around those challenges. Equally so in terms of the benefits they want to see out of growth. So if each community had a slightly different view on the benefits they wanted to see. And one thing that is quite interesting is, for instance, in Cairns, they wanted to look at the climatically responsible building design and infrastructure, because in Cairns that's a really huge discussion, as it probably is in other locations as well. But Cairns really wanted to know about how this is addressing climate change, whereas that wasn't necessarily as strong in other locations. And the last one we asked people what they want to know more about. And what we found very endearing from the Hume example is that they wanted to know, as the number one thing they wanted to know more about, the views of others in their community who are not like them. That is, I have not seen that answer come up number one before, but I think this community in Hume is really interested to understand what others who aren't like them are thinking, feeling about growth and change. And what we can see from that is when we actually then went to a community to start talking about the narrative of change and what the drivers and benefits were, each city actually has a very different way in that their community want to talk about that. So for instance, if we look at Hume, really what the views of others in my community who aren't like me is one of the key things they'll need to know about. Vibrancy, so how is this going to give my city a more vibrant outcome? How's this going to increase infrastructure utilisation? Tell me and how that's going to all work. And is it going to deliver diversity of housing and choice? Whereas in Penrith, there's things about vibrancy. They also need to probably know about future residents and how their needs are different from their own today. And actually understanding that discussion would be the main thing that helped that community get through. Greening the city, because heat and a lot of other discussions around parks and other things were in the community and needing to be seen as well. And how do they enhance access? Whereas if you went to the Cairns example, they needed to know what is this vision we're trying to move towards, because in Cairns they didn't have a North Star of what a future-ready tropical neighbourhood is. So they had a very different starting point with their community. And based on our index results, we can kind of start looking at how you need to differentiate that approach in your LGA. The last two parts of the index look at the trust in system actors and also the citizenship level of community. Now, time and time again, I didn't put the actual exact numbers up here, but I'm happy to talk to people about that at a different, over lunch. But local councillors come up time and time again as the community's trusted advisor on urban change. Councillors are the first point of call community will go to. So just as a local government group, how do you upskill councillors? How do you make sure councillors can have these generative conversations around urban change, that councillors themselves have a wide and diverse urban change literacy themselves, and really making sure as a strategy we're making sure councillors are ready for those conversations, because on 5 now implementations, elected officials come up time and time again, local government elected officials as the trusted advisor. I have to say they're closely followed by local government. So it is closely followed by local government, and in some states, state government as well, but not really as strongly as those other two people. So just as a kind of key takeaway is how you make sure your councillors are ready for these conversations, but also your staff as well, because they're going to be at the brunt of it. And the last part we talked to the community about is where they'd like to be sitting. So just remember, they don't participate. So we had like 85% of people had not participated in any conversations about change. But if they were to participate, or if you're asking them decisions points in a way, what they really want to be able to think about is needs of others who aren't like me and the needs of future generations. So they might not be currently participating, but those kind of angles in terms of what does this mean for me and what does this mean for the future of our community are some of the things the community were really wanting to discuss. And one of the key things that we need, as I highlighted before, need to update on our methodology also is the needs of future residents, and being really clear on how you as local government are actually putting future residents into your discussion and thinking. So as a developer, you'd get market research and you'd go and find what those future purchases might do. I know that practice isn't as common in a local government context, but understanding those future residents is a really important part of that kind of missing story. So what was an unintended outcome from our survey is that when people, we had 2 questions that bookend the survey, mainly just to see where people are at and where they ended with in the survey. And what we were really surprised with is that it actually shifted people to more supportive of change and more knowledgeable about sustainable urban change. So we actually could see through doing the 30-minute survey, people shifted and actually had more knowledge. There was some negative shift, but that was because people liked what was there today, but then there was a strange way it was calculated in that particular instance. But in saying that, they made a decision. So they actually had more information, because a lot of people didn't have any awareness before even doing the survey, so they've made an informed decision, which is at least better than not knowing. But what we could see through the survey, there was key points where we could start tracking where some of that change was happening. So people, when they were aware of change, was the first step. Understanding that mandate for change, so where we could see they were starting to understand that mandate, we could start seeing shifts. That they had some awareness of that North Star vision of where you're trying to go and some of those key concepts, and that they had some ability to explore those challenges and benefits, not just the benefits of growth. So when we looked at all this, what it started to tell us is that communities really are an underutilised asset for you in urban decision making. They purchase land, they purchase housing, they rent, they also elect in your elected officials, and so they actually are part of the system that's making decisions on these step change agendas. This is quite a simplistic way of doing it, but what we have been talking about a lot is when we talk to local governments, particularly, they're selling the benefits of growth. It's all rosy. These are the benefits. This is why it's going to be great and it's all going to be fantastic. And people see through that. They understand that it's not all going to be rosy. And what they really are needing and wanting to do is actually have an understanding of what's coming and how you invest in building their preparedness and knowledge for change. And so when we looked at our kind of results and what we started to see, the key part is, A, do you have an internal ambition? So before you even go and talk to anyone else, is there some foundations of your ambition that you're really clear on you're trying to achieve? Then where is your evidence base of where your community's starting point is at, not just based on our assumptions of who we're hearing from all the time, but where is actually our community starting from, because it also helps have different conversations in the community as well. And then how do we actually build preparedness and actually think about really specifically trying to build the awareness for change, strengthen that mandate for change, build the knowledge of those ambitions, and activate that citizenship, and how do we do it in a nuanced way? So, for instance, from the Hume and Penrith examples, you can see here how from the insights that we're able to get from the survey, how we start approaching those conversations with community or talking about the future could be quite different. So for instance, in Hume, one of the hooks is views of others who aren't like them. What's the housing diversity and choice, whereas a hook for Penrith may be around what those future residents might be and what they might need from our city. So we can start then developing individual approaches for your LGA on how to do that. Now, I know that that sounds like a really hard job that's going to land right on local government, and it is. And I think as a sector, what we're trying to think about is how do we actually, not-for-profit organisation, for instance. So when we started to see this data come out, we ran a transition leadership training program for councillors because we were like, we need to kind of see how we can help councillors. We are developing a conversation toolkit for councillors around urban change, so the big picture urban change discussions, some visual assets that councillors and conversation starters can share. We've also been looking at, we run a 2.5-hour masterclass for a local government on leading transformational urban change to actually take you through some of these concepts and see what that might be. That's our approach. For a local government point of view, there's many different levers you can pull. You're probably doing a lot of things already, but how do you strategically kind of think through what our community needs and start looking at how do you build the culture and climate? Is there policies, plans or programs you might be able to do? Is there demonstration projects? I was thinking about some of those housing fund. Is there ways you can do interesting medium density social housing projects through government grants? I don't know. So just thinking about what some of those ways you can start doing this, but also skilling yourselves as an organisation to be able to lead these kind of conversations because it is quite different to a normal urban change conversation in your city. So that's really me, I think. Oh, right on time. Where we need to stand.
I just wanted to thank Jen and first to pass it over to any questions that the audience may like to ask Jen. Is anyone out there? Back.
Conscious we are between lunch as well.
Thank you, Jen. Can you hear me? My name is Luis. I've managed the Economic Development, Advocacy and Tourism team in Armadale in Western Australia. This year we just broke the 100,000 residents mark, and we're growing to 150,000 within the next 20 years. So a very similar scenario like everyone in this room. In your presentation, you talked a lot about that community participation and research and surveys. Mm-hmm. Something that I've noticed in our community in the last few years is that survey fatigue that we all face. Every time we're putting a strategy out or a program out, we need to go and consult with residents. And it's always that challenge to get that meaningful that sweet number and that meaningful feedback that we want to get to actually inform our plans. And that is something that I'm keen to hear from you, like how you navigated that. And try to really tap into that loud majority, which we all have, and they believe that, you know, we have a really great place where we live, but sometimes we spend a lot of time in that other, in the minority sector. So.
Yeah. I could take you through a really specific example of a project I've been working on, and haven't had it cleared, so I won't talk just the name of it. But what was really interesting, we were talking through a major urban change project in a peri-urban location on a town centre project, so very significant town centre development. What was interesting is that they had established a community panel, so they paid a market research company to find a community panel of 300 people that they signed up for a 3-year period to take them through this design phase and things that they were doing on a project. So they invested in a community panel that was a demographically represented sample of their community. They then, each time they then did a survey or something they were doing, you can either incentivize everything they do, or I was very surprised at where 10 $50 gift vouchers actually went a long way. So each time we were getting around 150 people each kind of interaction, because we had a group of people that represented a voice of the community and a demographically representative voice that we could provide that opportunity to, and not everyone participated in everything, but they did participate enough that we actually did get some data. On the other side, we did, along with that kind of community panel engagement, we did public engagement, and we were getting 10 people to it. So as an investment, I felt from a practitioner's point of view, it was quite a cost-effective way to actually get that set up. How we are doing the index, so for instance, if you had a community panel already, I would just give this to the community panel and ask them to complete it and see what we got. The other way that is a very market research and a research approach is you engage in a market research company, you pay them to find the person, and you incentivize a person to complete the survey. So that's how we did this process, because we were quite specific on needing that kind of demographically sampled view. And I am aware that kind of approach is not something that local government often do. It's very common in the private sector, very common, but if there's times in place, and yes, it's an investment, but if there's times in place where you really need that kind of broader evidence base, it is worth it at the moment. There's other agencies that do things like they use social media channels, and they'll get 20 people, or a couple of thousand to complete it, but it has to be very quantitative only, so just tick box, and sometimes you're still only reaching the same kind of people who self-elect to do a survey anyway. So it's a tension, and you've got to find balance, which is why when we did it, the 150 to 300 is the mark that we've found works best.
Any other questions? Just a quick one from me. In a lot of the research we got, there's a lack of, I guess, information out there within the community, and this is where a lot of the fears have actually stemmed from. And I think, like most growth areas, our community are very time poor. Yep. They all work outside of the region, like for Western Sydney, like Wollondilly or areas like that, or Penrith. They travel to the city or Parramatta to go to work every day. It's a 3-hour round trip to go there. Kids play sport, all that kind of thing. What advice have you got for councils to help that engagement with the community where they are so time poor? Because they're the silent majority, yep, and they're the ones who, I guess, it's impacting the most, and we're not hearing those voices. So what advice have you got for councils? And I think most of us would be in that same situation.
First thing is consciously know who you're not hearing from. So actually do a bit of an audience analysis, like in a pure market sense. Who are you already hearing from at the moment? Who are you not hearing from? Where are they? So if they're at sports events, it might not be an engagement, it might just be information, which is we are growing by 150,000 people in 2041, full stop. Really just information, and it's not all at once, it actually might be a staged discussion over time. So in the next 6 months, our main messaging is that we are growing. And that's kind of the key message we're putting out there. The next 6 months is, this is where we want to get to with our growth. Visual or QR code or something that you can do where you meet people would be the first way. If there is those time and points where you do really want a representative input, I think you have to start budgeting for how you can hear from those people. And like any other, they're providing their input and their advice, really. They're a community member. They know the most about their life and their city and how they experience it. And I do believe we can incentivise them for their time to understand key voices we're not hearing from. So it's a tight balancing act, but I think actually having some budget to actually target people you're not hearing from, to make sure you're hearing those voices and it's informing your decision making at critical points is really important.
I don't think there's any other questions, so I'd just like to get everyone to put their hands together for Jen, and thank you very much for your